a regular meeting, but we have a special visitor, so that will add a little bit of time. And since our visitor is a man of 1,000 words, it actually may take a little bit longer. Anyway, welcome everyone. The usual protocol works. Toilets are behind, down the hallway. Stop when it starts the earthquake, when it's long. If it's short, we'll go and get under our bed desks. If it's long, then we all follow Chris Dolly, because he's a resident employee of Hawkesbury Regional Council. He knows exactly where we need to go to, so follow him. And Simon, you're not allowed to overtake him with your long legs, okay? Okay. But we formally will start this meeting, and I've asked Diane if she can please open us with a karakia. Thank you.
Kia Jeff. He noi tātou. I te atua ki a pai te hairanga o tēnei rā, me o mātou mahi o tēnei. Karehe mō tēnei rā I ngā wā katoa. Āmeni.
Amen. Thank you. Charles.
Charles, kia
Okay. Are there any notices? Apologies received?
No.
So I've got from Evelyn Ratama, I've received an apology. Received no others. So can we accept that apology by common consent? Thank you. Okay. Are there any conflict of interests? There are none. Carry on. We have minutes from the 15th of March. And we need to confirm those. So are there any, does anyone want to raise anything that was in those minutes that is not correct or that needs to be highlighted? If not, can I have a second on the mover to adopt these minutes, please? Elwyn and Keith, because otherwise you get told off by Keith. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Good. Okay. We would like to ask Keith Newman to come to the front. That means that the camera can also get a good look at you, for those who are online. As we all know, and we as a joint committee all got this publication, and it was given to us. And I must admit, as a relatively newbie, almost 6 years now in the role as the chair, I wasn't aware of the amount of work that you as a committee, you as a community, you yourself, and have put into this work. It's just, it's mind-boggling. And if it was something that would encapsulate the whole community, I would think your thoughts and ideas would have been widely adopted. With the effort that you've put in. Unfortunately, you've only represented a small community, and at times, even if you read through this, that even your whole community found it difficult to engage, which is a real pity, because of the amount of effort that you both have put in is just incredible, and especially you, Keith, as a chair. So you asked me before we started the meeting, what can I contribute? Well, you already have contributed a lot, but you meant really for this meeting here today. So I've asked you really to give a little bit of synopsis. You've got about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, not 20, okay? Because I know you're capable. To give us a bit of an idea, just a little bit of a start, because there's a lot of joint committee members who weren't there right from day one, including myself. Some of the frustrations that you've run across, and anything that we maybe learn as a joint committee going forward, and that would be really great.
Kia ora tātou. Aroha nui ki te tangata, kia tau, te rangi Māori e. It's very hard to keep your peace sometimes when you look around at all the frustrations that have built up over generations, really, of attempts to try and liaise with, to try and connect with the various councils and parties that have been involved in coastal protection. And the book, Saving the Cape Coast, I hope everybody's read it, and hopefully it will become a useful resource for the future, because as it says, it's a legacy of frustration and hope And the frustration really dates back to really the 1960s. And this is a generational issue. There have been numerous committees that have set up over time to say, how can we deal with our local authorities? How can we talk to them? How can we get some traction? How can we deal with the issues that we know are happening decade after decade and do something to prevent inundation or to keep river mouths open or to put in seawalls or to have groin fields, and so much community effort. And, I think there has been a lot of community engagement around this, but over the decades that community engagement has turned from hope to frustration. There's hope given, but no follow through. And I think really this document was an attempt to try and bring forward everything that has happened from 1931, when we all had the big shake-up that challenged our whole terrain. Some parts went up and we managed to create an airport, and some parts went down, and we're still dealing with a lot of that today as the coast is trying to re-establish itself in a natural way. And when you get things like Cyclone Gabriel coming along, and it's another shake-up for how can we get some traction to look after our little coastal area. And I'm one of those people that thinks you need to look after the front yard that you live in, and that includes, I live right on the coast, that includes weeding stuff and sweeping the cycle track, and occasionally, telling people to stop parking on the cycle track, because that's not what it's there for. And I think what happened in 2009 was I did not intend to get involved with this. Now, Anne's been involved in our community for a long time, and there was just an absolute frustration at a proposal that was being put to our community, 18 groins or managed retreat, and the cost for the 18 groins was a targeted rate on properties that would have set so many property owners just despairing because there was no way that they could afford it. And so WOW was formed, and we looked at the options. We got coastal engineers. We consulted with the community. We had meetings. We filled the Hastings Council chambers with, they'd never had so many people before. So, and we submitted to regional council, and we submitted to Hastings Council every time a long-term plan came up. And I have to say that Hastings has been amazing, because in all of the trauma that we've had out there, we've got the Clifton wall that's been put in place after the loss of 2 roads. We've got the Cape View Corner revetment wall in, which has probably prevented more and more of the road being swept away. We've had some action, but it's not come from the Coastal Hazards Committee. It's not come from regional council. It's been driven by Hastings. You need passionate people to be able to push for change. And I think that communication is a big issue. Sometimes we would put forward ideas, but the debate about, so how can we help? What can we do to make this happen never really happens. You get an executive decision at the bottom of your thing, sorry, the council hasn't got any money, we can't do anything. So this has gone on, and I've retired from WOW as chairperson, just as Councillor Anne Redstone has retired from the Hastings District Council. She was the first chairperson. I was just the loud mouth who stood up at the meeting and said, when all of the suits sat up in front and said, this is what we plan to do. I'd just come down from Auckland, and I just was amazed at the arrogance of a council standing in front of us, both councils, and saying, this is what we're going to do. And I think I stood up and I said, do you realise that's a recipe for the destruction of a local community? And the answer came back, yes, we know that, but, and I'm going, for goodness sake. So here we are, 14 years later, and we're still discussing the same sorts of issues. And the problem with me, as I drove in today, there's orange cones everywhere. I nearly bought one in because we're under deconstruction, and I think we're facing an identity crisis. You know, the Coastal Hazards Committee, been on that since the very beginning. WOW was sidelined over there and told, actually, we're going to do this amazing thing. We're going to have a vision for how we deal with the whole of the Hawke's Bay coastline, and we're going to get together and we're going to have all these workshops, and so put WOW on hold and its growing plan. So in the meantime, the costs have tripled in some cases, and we've not achieved anything other than what Hastings has done by being bold enough and stepping up and saying, if we don't protect the Cape Coast corner, then the retail area is at risk, the road's at risk, the power's at risk, the water's at risk. We need to do something. I always think that being proactive or preventative is better than trying to come up with a cure after another house has been swept away into the ocean. And I think we're back at that place again. We've had all of this cost that's come through Cyclone Gabriel, and I understand it. This is huge. But we can't be saying there's no money, we can't do anything, because the cost, as we've proven again and again and again, of doing nothing is greater than as if you did something. So I think we've got to come back to a place of we started off with a cellular approach. Let's look at this cell, then that cell. And I think the Cape Coast is the perfect cell where you can prove what can be done, whether it's a seawall. And Morris, you know, again, the local community's having to go, well, actually, groins in Tiawonga is not going to work. It's too deep. WOW said that in 2010 or 11, and we did all the studies on it, but you still want to put groins there, and you want to build a humongous metal shingle bund in front of Tiawonga that blocks everybody's view. Number one, where are you going to get the shingle from? You know, these costs were never talked about. When we started with the Coastal Hazards Committee, we were told, let's not talk about the costs. This is not about the money. Let's just do the strategy. Let's figure out, you know, what's possible, what can we look at, but costs were off the table until the Bayer report came out, and now you're talking 50 million to 160 million to do the protection work, and that just, people cannot contain that information. That is just too big, and already with rates rises on the way, we're going to have to rethink the strategy, just like you're going to have to rethink Tiawonga. You know, groins won't work there. So now Morris Smith and others are meeting together to say, well, what are the alternatives? So now the community's doing the work that this group should have done in the first place. And like I say, the Bayer report is just the costs are impossible. And then the shingle, again, all of this huge amount of shingle with this idea that you need to replace any shingle that's moved off the beach by the equivalent amount of shingle from somewhere else. Where and why? Why on earth can't you move shingle around on the beach as it's there when it's needed to solve the problem, to protect the lagoons, to protect the wetlands, to protect the areas that did get inundated during Gabriel because the bund on the crest wasn't high enough, and you've got to go for a consent. So I worry. I mean, all right, it's all in there. I was going to do a whole prepared thing, but I'm really not. You know, I got a letter from Peter Bevan, the former chair, just yesterday, and he's just read it, and he said, looking back on my involvement, if I have one regret, it's not pushing the participating councils harder to get on with implementing the strategy. And he says he feels that we've lost 5 years, but Peter's way up north in his retirement home, and he's keeping in touch on these kinds of things. But, you know, the thing that bothers me is that when a community does get together and you do have participation and you do have buy-in and agreement, and in a community like ours at the Cape Coast, we had so many meetings, we knew we were representing the people. And on so many of these things, every time we made a submission, we used social media, we talked to people, we had public meetings. The thing that really, I think, disappointed me was the H21, which has always been at the core. Well, it's H18 now, isn't it? We've lost 2 of them, got wiped away, and now it's still it's a destruction zone there. Some of those places should have been pulled down ages ago because we were trying to protect them, but they've gone too far. They're now danger zones. But the reality is that we managed to get just about all of the members who owned property there to agree to fund and be involved in building a wall in front of their properties. That was an impossible task. Well, and Hastings District Council to some degree, we all worked on a way to actually put some protection in there. The costings were done. We did it right. But that group came to Hawke's Bay Regional Council and said, all right, what are our obstacles? What's the way forward? These are not ignorant people. These are developers. These are people who know about building. They know about the coastal restrictions. And they came to the meeting, and when they started to raise the idea of actually adjusting their buildings or, you know, how can we get around this? There was somebody who stood up in a senior council position and said, sorry, not going to happen. Have you read the coastal hazards? Have you read the coastal report? It's not going to happen. So that was the end of conversation. And in conversation with some of those people, they said it must have been a misunderstanding. That person must have been speaking outside of their responsibilities within the council. But I just found this letter that I got from the chief executive at the time, who actually says, no, that person was acting well within their rights, James Palmer. I mean, I could quote it if you like. It says, no, she was talking perfectly legitimately about what can't be done. So there was no flexibility. There was no willingness to engage with this group of people who had agreed that they were prepared to pay for a solution. In fact, they got shut down. 2 years of work gone like that. Is that what is going to happen when the Coastal Hazards Group, supposedly in August, comes under the full purvey of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council? Is this going to be the ferret in the chook house? Are we not going to make any progress because that group stands behind its own understanding of the coastal hazards and the coastal document and all the rest of it, rather than being the pioneering visionary group that said to the country, we'll show you how to do it. We're not showing you how to do it. We're actually sitting behind bureaucracy and saying, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. I don't see the vision that is needed to carry this strategy forward. I was excited about this strategy. I wanted to be part of this. In fact, you made me a spokesperson to stand up before the councils and said, let's do that. And you're going to go and do consultation with the community. I can't agree with where things are at the moment. It's overly costly. You haven't determined where the shingle is going to come from, and we don't even know whether any of this is going to be consentable, because when it's under the regional council, there are people there who will say, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do this, rather than saying, how can we help, how can we do things differently, how can we work with the community, how can we be creative, how can we use imagination, how can we turn it into a vision rather than a regulation situation where the very group that's supposed to be leading this actually has the brakes on and won't take them off. We've got to do things differently. We've got to do things in small chunks. We've got to meet the need before it becomes a problem. And that's about all I want to say. I think if you haven't got a copy of this, let me know. I think we've got an identity crisis. Orange cones are out. We don't know what's going on. We're looking around. There's no workmen there. There's lots of orange cones. But we have to believe that in the future, when the cones are gone, the roads will be better, protection of the coast will be better, councils will be talking to each other in a way that is collaborative rather than competitive. And I would like to believe for a much better future, a legacy of hope rather than frustration. So far, it's been pretty frustrating. Thank you.
Okay. Wait on. There may be some questions for you, and I'm pretty sure there will be questions.
Yeah, kia ora, Keith. That was amazing to see your passion, and I'm sorry that you've had so much frustration over the years. I suppose this is an incredible document that's going to be used throughout our future work. Just wondering, how long did it take you to put all this together?
Well, I think it was, I mean, it's not me. I represent a community, otherwise I wouldn't do this. If it was just me, I'd be in a mental home by now. But the idea of actually knowing that you're standing for the public good of people who are really concerned for their properties and for their future, and whether or not they should continue to maintain their buildings or let it go, is the big issue for me. So I was gradually culling from every report that was made, everything that came to me as a career journalist. I thought one day this is going to make some sense. So this is a distillation of all the reports that have been made to both Hastings District and Hawke's Bay Regional Council over 14 years.
Yeah.
Okay. Sam?
All right, Chair. Thank you, Keith. I haven't read it all. I've dipped in and out. And the first thing for me as a previous Humwana resident was that it brought together bits of history that I knew and bits of history that I didn't. And so I see it as a fantastic compilation of the bits of history that I lived around and would see, you know, the actions of you and others of that committee over time. I was far enough removed and too busy on other things to get involved in that. But I can bring that sort of that previous resident's view to the power of the work that you did and the twists and turns that you've had to go through. What I'm trying to understand now, what disturbs me most about your kōrero just now is that by your description, we're now at a point where you seem to be indicating that the community doesn't agree with the adaptation pathway that is the core for your area of the project that we're administering as a joint committee and trying to take through to the regional council to say, this is what the community supports. So you're telling me there's a massive disconnect between where you believe the community's at and the practicality of the implementations in these adaptation pathways. So this is very serious news to me.
Yeah, no, I agree. The practicalities, unaffordable, unattainable, overly blown, the whole big picture. You put numbers like 175 million or 50 million in front of people, we can't comprehend it. It needs to be taken down into small slices. All right, we can do that for 2 million. We can do that for 1.5. We can work, and that way the community can think, yeah, my property's worth an investment of a targeted rate or whatever. Now you're having a conversation. When the numbers are that big and the infrastructure proposed is so huge, people cannot get their heads around it. It needs to come back to, you know, kanohi ki te kanohi, how we can have that conversation together and people can go, yeah, I understand how that would be. I well supported the coastal hazard strategy being taken over by the regional council because the alternative is Hastings, Napier and regional council not agreeing. Now we're talking generations of infighting between the councils, blaming each other for all sorts of things. We cannot do that. We're too small a region across the region to have that kind of nonsense go on any further. You know, you pull resources, now you've got something to work with. If everybody's opposing each other and getting in the way, up go the consenting costs. And the consenting costs are ridiculous. If the regional council is going to get involved in this process, it needs to put the consenting cost as part of its public good involvement and say, well, actually, we can suck some of that up rather than putting it back on the community because we are protecting the infrastructure and the coastline that we're responsible for. If that's seen to be happening, now we've got a kōrero, now we've got a conversation. If it's like all the cost comes back on the community, don't even bother consulting us because people cannot get their heads around this. You need to find where the need is and work, you know, very carefully with people to say, we see there's a problem here, we're going to fix it. Replace the pump station at the Homoana domain because it's not up to purpose. But that was said 40 years ago. Flooding occurs there. Yeah, we knew 40 years ago, but still the capacity hasn't increased. Oh, we'll bring in a tractor from across the bridge. What if the bridge is flooded out? You know, there's so many things that are preventative that could really assist each little community. And I know that's happening on the wider scheme. You're looking at all of those things, but Cape Coast feels like it's missing out. We're not even mentioned in the documentation. 24 homes got flooded with water up to about here. We came up with a plan. We actually met with the joint councils at the Hastings Regional Council. Mayor Sandra called it. A new group was formed. We had a strategy. Right, let's talk. Let's discuss. Communication was like nil. Even now, some of that communication is just starting to come together. You know, we had a whole strategy, a whole plan, but we weren't talked to. So there's a new group on board now, and that's Marcel and Morris and Roy, and I'm going to step in the background and just be a cheerleader because I don't have the energy to do this anymore. I've got other things to do with my life.
Good. Any other questions? Yes.
Kia ora Keith, ānā mihi o te tautoko i o kōrero. And I'm new to this table, so it is disturbing for me to hear the frustration that comes through in your kōrero. But I'd just like to say that there's some clear values that come through, and they're pretty simplistic to a new person at this particular table. The community participation and that constant communication with our community, and obviously the collab between councils, to push that aside because, at the end of it, it's all about our communities because that's what we sit here, that's who we represent. And if we can push past all that other stuff and get to the crux of it. So, I'd just like to say thank you for bringing those values back to the table. And I hear your frustration. I like to think that your document there sits amongst all of our documents at the table when we are talking and making decisions and strategising, because that's a lot of work. Why reinvent the wheel when it's already sitting there? There's a lot of community feedback sitting inside your book and your document, so it should sit, at our table when we're talking. And you're right, has your document been referenced or mentioned? According to you, it hasn't. So that's pretty disturbing. So I'd just like to say kia ora ānā mihi for your work with your community. And without people like you in the community, we don't hear those community voices. So kia ora, thank you.
Yeah, I see the Coastal Hazards Group as being a group that can facilitate that collaboration between councils, and if it's done right, if it's done relationally rather than transactionally, which is what the Treaty of Waitangi is about in my understanding, it's got to be about relationships. We've got to be talking to each other rather than just coming down with edicts and bureaucracy that just crushes creativity. Let's get creative. Thanks.
I've got a question for you, if I'm allowed.
Yeah.
Your community, are they still as passionate about what we as a strategy, or what WOW saw as a strategy going forward? Are they still there? And are we still able to get them involved? Because as like Diane said, that's the most important. That's we as a joint committee, that's our single most task almost, to actually listen to community and have community involved in this. And that's how the strategy actually was very successful in its early days, because that's how it was seen around the country. Here is a strategy that actually has listened and is working with its community to develop cells that actually the community is comfortable with the protection of. Is your community still with you on that?
Well, it's hard to know because community representatives weren't involved as much in the latter half of the involvement of the strategy. Communication, there hasn't been much communication. I think that there's an uncertainty right now. We don't know, because you don't know. You're in an identity crisis as a group because you don't even know whether you're going to, in August, be the body that represents all the councils, or whether it moves across to the regional council, or what that looks like. I think everybody's in this limbo place. Hastings District Council's being told, get on with it and do what you can before we come in and become the controlling body. But I don't imagine anybody in Hastings is confident that they should start any projects for protection, because we're in this limbo uncertainty zone. And of course the community, they've got no idea what you're up to.
Yeah, you're right. It's a can in the middle of the road. It gets kicked further down. But your community, as you said yourself, that you're keen to see this happen under HBRC, is that still the view you think of your community? Because that's very important, the way we're going forward, because we need a strong mandate to be able to do what we're hoping to do.
Yeah, I think you need to improve your communication and prove that you're not, like I said before, the ferret in the chook house that's got to just sort of say, no, 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 no. That's not a visionary group. That's not the Coastal Hazard Strategy group that I became involved in. Whatever happens, it has to work with the various communities and get them excited and passionate about the way forward. So needs to be re-envisioned. You need to cast the vision again so that people get what you're on about. At the moment, there are big numbers that people go, whoa, not going to happen, not in my backyard, can't afford it, that'll break me. I won't be able to afford it, particularly on top of the rates increases. Got to rethink this.
Yeah.
Got to go back to the drawing board with some of these pathways and figure out how to keep people engaged, because at the moment I think there's a fear around what might happen under HBRC. You still support it, but you want to see a visionary approach that takes everybody with you.
Great. Thank you. Well, I did say there's many words inside Keith in his head, and there's still more. And once again, thank you very much for this publication. We'll put it in our briefcases from now on whenever we come to the Joint Committee, so as a reminder of the visions that you've expelled here to us today. So once again, much appreciated. And just to give you a bit of a background, those who don't know, Keith wrote a very good book, Bible and Treaty. So how that actually came together, it's inspirational, it's really good, and it talks about collaboration, working together in one spirit, and that's really great. Thank you very much for that. Good. Good. Do we don't have to adopt this at all. I don't think we can make it official in our history. But once again, what we've heard, we should not forget what community is capable of doing. So we're now going to go to item number 5, and that's project manager's update. Chris, over to you.
So I think Simon, as the project manager, will take us through this, Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chair. Okay, so in terms of the regular project dashboard, there's no status changes to note for this report, but a couple of verbal updates I'd like to make, which I've kind of forecasted in the paper itself. The first I'd like to speak to is the Tiawanga community engagement. Keith just talked about this briefly in his discussion. It's not formal in terms of this committee yet, but I guess to update this committee on where the thinking is in Tiawanga right now from a meeting that a few of us, including the chair, attended, and Elwyn, late last week. So in Tiawanga post-Gabrielle, there was real concern about erosion of the beach crest, and in fact, particularly exposing the lagoon at Tiawanga to inundation from the sea. That beach crest got down to about a car's width from what I could see from those images, so very close to being breached by the sea, and if it had been breached, significant implications for that community would flow from that. So the community has stood up some work to look into what the options might be to respond to that. I think the situation's less dire right now. There's been a bit more accretion, so we're not an immediate risk, but certainly during that period there was it could have been the next high tide. It got very close. So where that thinking is at now is the community has come up with a proposal for some armouring of the crest, essentially initially between the lagoon and ocean, to try and provide a bit of a backstop to further erosion there. They've got as far as looking at some possible designs, some possible costs. Our meeting last week was around the fact that this proposal does not currently align with what the strategy says. And I guess for this committee, the key thing is how do we reconcile that potential disconnect, right? So if there's a whole bunch of work behind a strategy which has proposed some groins and nourishment, there's been a big gap in time since that work was done, and now there's an alternative idea being put forward by the community. How do we join those things up in some sensible way? Obviously, we can't just throw out all the work of the panels back in the day, but if there is strong support for an alternate, how do we consider that? So it is a live discussion at the moment. That community's working closely with Hastings District Council. I mean, that is the working arrangement, right, where a key issue arises. At the moment, the TAs sort of deal with that in the primary role with HBRC in a support and regulatory capacity. So that's continuing. But we need to figure out some way to align those conversations with the strategy. So that's a brief intro. I'm not wondering if Councillors Van Beek or Corbyn, anything to add to that summary?
Well, yes. So the situation is happening faster than what the strategy is being implemented. And it is a particular situation with a particular pinch point, and the strategy of the groins, well, not only to implement them and get them going, but for the benefit of them to reach down to the Tiawanga Lagoon is going to take a period of time. And I don't know what that time is. So I came home from that meeting saying there's an immediate issue that the strategy is not going to address
In time.
in time. Well, I mean, it's now. It's now.
Yeah, and I'm similar. And once again, here's a possibly a pragmatic solution that the community has thought through. And Hastings District Council is looking at it as well. Nothing formally has happened because under our MOT, they need to inform us if there's actually going to be anything done formally in regards to building in this space because of the transition to Hawkesbury Regional Council. So just to protect Hawkesbury Regional Council, that we're not going to take on lemons when the time comes. So that's why we need to have vision all over this. But it makes a lot of sense. There is another aspect to this as well that appeals to me is apparently, and it's only apparently, and that's not a very scientific word, the structure that they're looking at is scalable, so it actually can be raised if there is an issue with raising sea level rise, and also there's dissipation of energy into the coast. Once again, you've got wave directions and whatnot, so that there are different views on. This is very early days yet, but I think because it's now, this is an issue, we need to possibly through this process that they're pushing for, understand that we as a joint committee can actually adapt to anything that is actually can be done now, but is different to the strategy. So we need to actually get a head around. So what's the way forward on that? Can we, because we actually don't know. Do you know, Chris?
So the immediate way forward is there is an agreement between the councils of how to progress short-term solutions, and that fairly sits through that agreement with the local council.
MOT?
Well, through that, and then if it's more formally through the MOT. So there is a mechanism for the work to proceed. The big issue then is if there's changes to the longer-term strategy as a result, how we align those two matters, and I think that's something the TAG can go away and think. But the issue is we've had a huge amount of analysis and community participation in developing a strategy. How can the community be assured that the change is just as rigorous? And I think that's the test that we've got to sort of work through. So that's a bit of work for TAG, because really the principle was really any work can continue at pace if it's aligned with the strategy. But where we come up with a change to the strategy, that's, I think, what we need to navigate. And that would be of great interest to the Regional Council through the MOT discussion. And so, yeah, as I said, I think it's a bit of work for TAG to go away, have a bit of a think through possible mechanisms for that to occur, and then bring them back at a later date.
I don't see it as what's being proposed replacing what the strategy is. Yeah. It's actually fixing the current situation, and it's for a 200 metre section of the coast. It's not from not doing the whole Tiawanga cell. So it's at the moment, I think it is the strategy plus this.
So it's a complementary activity. So I think we just need to work through that, and formally, and we can bring something back.
So I've got a suggestion, but first to add, the lagoon is actually, the Tiawanga lagoon, that is actually at stake. That's what is going to be protected. If that's going to be inundated, that actually is stormwater. It's like a stormwater hold. And so that's Hastings District Council. But that water, so if that would be inundated, we have stormwater issues, how we actually can get it out into the coast, into the sea, and that's a real issue. So that actually becomes an issue for Hastings District Council as well as the Hawkesbury Regional Council. So I would propose, I'm not sure formally whether we actually, if we can, give direction to TAG through maybe a resolution here today. Then at least we actually formally asked the TAG to actually do this work on our behalf, if that's what we need to do. Hayley, you?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because it's not actually under our remit of work, is it? Because it's currently sitting with HDC. I suppose just a flavour that I would like to be, or a lens to look through with this work, just picking up on what Keith was talking about earlier. Like, I suppose our role as local government in the Act is decision-making on and by and on behalf of our community. So if our community are saying they want to change TACT, I think we should be as enabling of that as possible and approach everything with a can-do attitude. And acknowledging there's complexities and all of that, but not coming with the complexities first, coming with the, okay, let's work together but first, and then going, okay, so there's these things we need to think through. So it's probably more of a style thing. I think probably our officers have got that, but just hearing some of the frustrations this morning, it'd be really great if we could start to shift that dial.
Good. Any other? Yep, Simon?
Just a couple of things to add. I think there is an interim response plan this committee has looked at and approved, which is meant to guide things exactly like this, right? So as a hotspot issue emerges, there's a protocol in place to respond to it, which I think goes to your point, Councillor Corbyn, that there is a mechanism to proceed. That relies on Hastings having the resources to do it, obviously, but there's a pathway there. We have advised the community reps there to submit their ideas to this committee so it can be formally considered. So we hope to have that before the next meeting, which is in June 17. Thank you, about then. So certainly I think if there's a resolution today for TAG to investigate that, we can come prepared to the next meeting, not only with information from the community, but also analysis by TAG as well. So just to run up those things, I do believe they also intend to submit on the long-term plans for both councils as well. So there'll be more to come from this group, no doubt, and I think there is a pathway both to consider the proposed works, but also for it to come to this committee over the next sort of few weeks.
Okay.
And just on that, what decisions will be looking to make from that information?
It's a really good question. I think what we have to figure out, but this is my own view, does the strategy as it currently proposed, does that align with or sort of misalign with what's being proposed now for the seawall? And if, as Councillor Corbyn says, there's an arrangement whereby the seawall can work in combination in a complementary way, then that's, I think, all good. If we get to a place where actually those things don't line up, that gets a little bit trickier for this committee to consider. I think it'd be very difficult for us to, before September, fully assess all the angles of this option. We did a whole bunch of coastal modelling on the groin proposal as it's currently in the strategy. It'd be very hard to pull that off with the same degree of rigour by the time we consult on that. So there's maybe some ways to consider that, but to me the primary question is, are these complementary or conflicting? And if they're conflicting, how do we resolve that?
Okay.
And also the implication of that on the MOT.
Correct. And also implication on the funding model, right? Are we now funding 2 interventions? And are we spreading ourselves too thin? So there's a few financial and strategy alignment and consenting and modelling things to work through, but fundamentally, this strategy is meant to be adaptive, right? That's its whole ethos.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So we need to be able to respond to this.
Okay. Do I read it right, listening to the room, that we can leave it with you and TAG to do this work, so at least we're prepared for the 17th? Or we need to, is the committee wanting to formalise this somewhat more so that we actually definitely have it on our agenda to work through?
So, Chair, there's no problem with being tasked by the committee. That way it'll go in as an action and there's a paper trail.
Great.
And then you can have confidence that it will come back.
Okay. I'm quite happy to do that, to take it on board like that.
Just trying to catch my brain up. There's sort of 2 pits of work here, isn't there? There's the looking at what the initial intervention is, which is kind of not our business. That's kind of HDC's business to manage the upfront stuff. But then there's the keeping our committee up to date on what that is and then looking at the implications of that. And so we're looking to task the TAG with the second piece of work. Is that right?
Yeah. And then I think there's a third part to that, is that we as a committee need to understand, because the work has been slowing. and erosion and inundation has happened since. And so we need to look, how can we be adaptive as a committee with the strategy? Is the strategy locked in concrete, or is it adaptive? So we need to understand that, just in case, because there may be other solutions that other communities or this community may come up with that actually make sense now that the goalpost or the traffic cones have changed. So that's another point that we maybe need to think about, not for today, I think, but we just need to think that through. Okay? Good.
Yeah, I think there's a real danger of us really sort of putting our stake in the ground and saying this is our strategy, and not being willing enough to move from it. And there's a balance, right? Because the community also want, what's the word, confidence that there's a plan and a way forward. So, yeah.
Okay, good.
But the other aspect of that is the speed that this is happening, the strategy is happening, and the environment is taking over.
Yeah.
It's going faster.
We've heard that loud and clear this morning from Keith, and I think we need to take note of that. You're absolutely right.
Thank you, Chair. So second verbal item, if I can. The second one was an announcement from central government last Friday around this new inquiry into climate adaptation. You might recall this committee submitted on the previous government's inquiry, and there's a reasonably large submission put together around our experience and the things the inquiry should consider. This is kind of the reboot, version 2.0 of that same inquiry. A few little shifts though. It's now, the last was under the Environment Committee, and this one is under the Finance and Expenditure Committee. So perhaps a shift in focus. It's very early days, but from what I've seen so far, there's a large focus on funding and how the government's role, local government, insurance, property owners, the whole mix, how those all come together to fund adapting to climate change. The intention, I understand, is to come up with a framework for climate adaptation for the nation. Is Gavin Ide in the room? Yes. Gavin, that's a very high-level summary, but anything you'd like to add in terms of what you've learned about the inquiry, acknowledging it started last Friday, that you can add to that summary?
That's the high level side of things, just in terms of what next or what comes out of this inquiry. The Select Committee is to report back with its work by end of September this year, and the next line from various announcements is that if there is any legislation required to follow through on that climate change adaptation framework, that would be introduced in 2025. So it's still a slow burn, but it's taking the previous Select Committee inquiry process, as Simon says, to version 2.0.
Yeah, and somewhat usefully, the submission that we put in last time will, we understand, be picked up and looked at by this new inquiry. So we're still in the mix. I believe there may be further opportunity to submit.
Yeah.
This one
So
as well.
if you've already submitted, there will be an opportunity to add to it, given the slightly different shift in terms of reference, and there's also an opportunity for any new person to submit to this inquiry if you haven't previously submitted.
And as Chair, I would like to thank you for the work that you've put in there. I think the deadline was 5 o'clock, and you and I were still communicating at 4 o'clock whether something should be in or out. So once again, thank you very much for your willingness to stay. I think it was Friday afternoon. That normally this building is empty at that time, because I know that they're all in the CBD somewhere doing stuff, but you were still there, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So I think for this committee, we need to keep an eye on what that does and what that might come up with in terms of how things are paid for and funded, and what that might mean for this strategy. As we learn more, we'll certainly report back, but I don't know what concrete information we'll have between now and then. I suppose the key thing in my mind is that if we are consulting in September on this strategy, at the same time the government's announcing something out of the inquiry, we'll need to be communicating clearly with our communities around what does all this mean. It's a heads up.
Okay.
Do we have an idea of the scope of what they're hoping to put out? Like, would they reach into how we should be doing our funding and essentially supersede the work that we can do in our workshop this afternoon? Or do you think they would just be like, oh, we'll fund up to 10% from a government pool, or
Look, I
whatever
think
it is?
we don't know is the answer, but I think this has always been the challenge for this group, right? As we've sat here many times and considered, do we pause and wait for this next new thing, or do we carry on? This is yet another next new thing. So I guess we don't know. From what I've read at the very high level, they are looking really closely at the question and how that should best be funded. From what I've read, there's a bit of a change in philosophy to go from a very retreat-orientated preference previously to perhaps a more retreat as a last resort flavour now. So there's perhaps a bit of a shift in philosophy behind this. But from what I've seen, there's a real focus on the funding question. How do you pay for interventions? Who should pay for it? What's the role of central government, property owners? So it is certainly playing in the same space that we're working in right now. But as to when outcomes will arrive, I guess that's the unknown.
Yeah, I'm looking at project timeline, and that's really about getting to the point where it goes out for consultation. But beyond that, what is the confidence that the strategy is consentable, will receive consent, if the Tauranga Maori workstream hasn't been completed?
That's a good question. We have a whole item on Mātauranga Māori, so perhaps we'll wrap it up in that conversation, if that's okay. I'll come back to that one.
So my question will be, how does that work stream, or the fact that it hasn't been done, influence the consentability?
I'll come back to that one.
Okay, we'll do that under that particular item.
So thank you, Chair. That's all I want to add verbally to my paper. So unless there's any other questions, that's all from me.
Okay, any questions for Simon? If not, I would like a second on the mover for the project manager's report update. Owen and Hayley. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay, then the next item is the item that Owen mentioned, the Mātauranga Māori workstream update. Simon, that's you.
Thank you, Chair. I can speak to that one. So firstly, apologies from Aramanu Ropiha, who's our consultant advisor on this work stream. She's hoping to be here today, but for family reasons couldn't be, unfortunately. So I'll do my best to provide the update that she was hoping to provide. The paper outlines it really, but in high points, there has been a range of conversations over the past 6 months-ish with various PSGEs and other iwi organisations. The consistent message has been that there's interest in this work, but simply the capacity to engage just isn't there. So it's not really a surprise. I think we knew that, but that has now been made explicit. There is good interest, but there's no capacity. So a couple of things in response to that. Aramanu has elected to proceed with the kind of desktop analysis piece where she is looking to get information from the various PSGEs and others around what's already in the public realm in a Mātauranga Māori sense. The idea is to prepare 3 culture values frameworks, one for each PSGE area, that captures what's already out there and tries to express the values, maybe even the sites that are out there, and how the strategies to work with and reflect those values. So that is a work in process. The intent is that those frameworks would be presented back to the PSGEs for their review and, we hope, ratification. We can't pin a time frame to that. That's not on us, but certainly the thinking is that if there can be more heavy lifting done within the strategy rather than putting that effort on those PSGEs, that is the way we can best move this forward. So that is, I suppose, where things stand right now. Aramanu has been collecting information from consents processes, from various plans that organisations have put out, various policy processes. There's lots of information out there, but compiling it now in a way that can be shared with those PSGEs. So some progress, but I suppose not where we'd hope to get to for reasons that are understandable. So if I can flick now to your question, Councillor Corbyn, the short answer is I don't know. We have heard from some PSGEs that given how much work is on their books right now, the best they can do is re-engage when it comes to a consenting process. When it gets to that point, there's something concrete, we'll then engage in that. The risk with that, of course, is that you end up engaging potentially in a conflicting position, right? Ends up being litigious and you're in a hearing, and we don't want to get to that point. So there is a potential that as we get through the next phases, we end up in a position where the strategy is proposing an intervention and we have opposing submissions from these organisations or hapu marae. We are trying to avoid that. We've heard consistently that a key concern from mana whenua is the gravel nourishment proposal, from concerns around impacts on mahinga kai in particular. To try and get ahead of that, we have stood up this coastal ecology work stream, so we're trying to identify where those risks might be and put some more work around those. And we'll just keep that door open for engagement. But at this stage, unless there's anything else people can suggest, we're proceeding as we are, which is this desktop work, keeping the door open as we can and trying to keep engaging as best we can.
Sam.
Kia ora, Chair. Look, I'm really keen to see what, if anything, Di has to say, on this, so I won't get in the way of that. But I just wanted to say, look, from my point of view, this seems like a sensible approach. It recognises that each of the PSGEs will have their own view and have their own cultural framework, but we've got a person in the middle trying to bring some consistency around that and making progress. So I commend the TAG for where we're at the moment in the circumstances. Thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora team. So just a bit of an update. So Aramanu has been working with me in our PSG, so trying to undertake that desktop activity with the values as much as we possibly can. In response to the question there about resource consenting. So I'm the environmental planner inside the PSG, so unfortunately, or fortunately, all of the resource consents come across my table, so I see them in a weekly, I guess, bundle. So they are bundled from Hawke's Bay Regional Council, HDC and CHBDC. So they come across my table, so I do see them. Once I see them, that's my little flag to engage with our mana whenua. If there are some reasonably large consenting applications, and likely this is probably one of those that would come across my desk, and I would go and engage with our mana whenua in that particular area of interest. So I guess there's some oversight there, given that there's been an absence of mana whenua at various times throughout this 10-year process. Hence I'm here now and sort of trying to plug some gaps, but I guess, just a level of comfort that we do have some eyes on it. We are trying to make some ground here. We've got Noel, one of our reps that is going to join, hopefully, join the team. And I guess probably just we need to catch up a little bit, and I just wanted to ask if there's any opportunity, I can't seem to find anything, of the engagement or minutes of any previous meetings that have gone in over these last 10 years with our mana whenua groups, just so I could catch up myself and Noel, we could catch up to see where we got, who was engaged, with perhaps tag and catch up, I guess, a little bit as to where the kōrero got and where it sort of stopped, and can I pick that up again?
And that possibly will include the community panels as well. So that's actually has always been a link and a request out as well. And we've in the early part, it was always good engagement. But I think the work that you now have to undertake is far-reaching, and
and I guess people just get fatigued from hui. That's probably what it is, and they don't have the capacity to carry on. So not that they don't want to, they do, but they just don't know how to, because they get fatigued from, this isn't just the only committee that, they're participating in, they're stretched across, multiple. But I do acknowledge that, we have picked it up with Aramanu.
So through the Chair, perhaps let's make sure on the actions that we record that request for a compilation of engagement and key outcomes, just make sure that's captured in the minutes. We'll make sure we follow up with that, Diane. Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
Chair, just this could have implications for our deadline of September 24 if this doesn't happen. What's the backstop position?
Through the Chair, we've explored that a little bit with Aramanu. The current thinking is that that we proceed, that it shouldn't affect that deadline in September. So that September deadline is about putting out the full strategy consultation, and there's a lot more work to come after that, right? So the thinking is that that we proceed regardless. At this stage, there's been no feedback we've heard direct from PSGs to go, well, you should stop. So we are carrying on, but ideally would have, more than we have now. But I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why we don't, which are understandable. Certainly since the cyclone, a lot of feedback had was there's just no bandwidth, and we can't force that. So I think for now we carry on. That's where we've landed with Aramanu and the team, but just keep that door open.
Thank you.
It's probably worth noting too, the regional council is currently undertaking, just commenced a complementary piece of work with a specific Mātauranga Māori work stream across the whole of council. And so one of the aims is to actually understand what's happening in all the various joint committees and other bits and pieces and bring all of that work together. So there's potential to leverage off, work that's happening with our planning team, work that's happened previously with integrated catchment management. And so that's just really commenced, but it's another complementary activity to really build up that picture as well.
Okay. Yep.
Quick one, Mr. Chair. Is this all bearing in mind that, does it Ngāti Pāro have a coastal management plan?
Yes, and particularly with the port, right? There's a whole lot of work that's gone into that. So,
So that should be part of the mix already.
behind us, we've been engaged with Ngāti Pāro,
Excellent. Any other questions or comments? If not, can I have a seconder and a mover? Anne and Zan, all those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Ayes have it. Okay, we'll go to the regulatory workstream update, and that is you again, Simon.
Thank you, Chair. I will hand over to my colleague Deborah, who's on screen there very shortly, just as a brief intro to this one. So this is part of the full strategy content that will come to you in the next meeting, but we're keen to bring this one to you early. You'll be aware, and in the paper there's the outline of the strategy you've seen before with the 9 sort of key parts, which part covers which element. This is a regulatory framework component of the strategy. It hasn't had much attention over the past couple of years. It's really debated around things like what are the fiscal interventions and how do we pay for them. But this is actually a really crucial part that we're keen to bring to you now for a quick discussion and to sort of forecast where this is heading in the strategy. There are 2 sort of major issues to consider under this. The first is, and this kind of touches on Keith's point as well, around the difficulty of gaining consents for this work. So the first question is, how can the regulatory framework work with the strategy as opposed to become a barrier to implementation? And the second, perhaps trickier issue is this one of maladaptation. How do we make sure that by increasing resilience at the coast, we don't actually encourage development in at-risk areas and ultimately make things worse? So it's quite a different flavour to past discussions on interventions and costs, but equally important, and we're keen to bring that to you today. So Deb has been the author for this discussion paper and has a presentation to run through, so I'll hand over to you, Deb.
Cool, thank you. Just checking you can hear and see me okay.
All good, thank you.
Awesome, and I'll just share my screen with the presentations. You can just give me a thumbs up that you can see that okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Great, thank you. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for having me at your meeting this morning. So as Simon said, I'm Deborah Kissick. I'm a planner in Simon's team at Traverse Environmental based in Taupo, and coming to you from Taupo this morning. So really just wanted to talk you through the content of this background paper that's going to inform the regulatory chapter of the strategy. I'm aware that this is quite planning heavy content and they're quite complex issues that are being covered, so I'm trying to go through this in a simplistic way as I can to not lose you all, but yeah, I appreciate that it is quite heavy going, so bear with me. So the regulatory chapter purpose is to set out the requirements of the local planning and regulatory framework that will need to be in place to support successful implementation of the strategy. So this diagram is just intended to show you how it all fits together. So we've got the regulatory background paper that we're talking about this morning feeding into the regulatory chapter. So it's intended to support and inform the development of this chapter, rather than the chapter itself needing to do all the relevant commentary and evaluation. And then from there, once the strategy is in place, informing how the committee and the councils will influence legislation change and change to the regional policy statement, regional plans and district plans to implement the strategy. So the background paper considers the previous consentability and policy and regulatory review reports that were developed by Mitchell Daish back in 2020. So the paper makes recommendations, including recommendations from these reports. And then we also explored two key regulatory issues. So the first being the potential for perverse outcomes or unintended consequences to arise from implementing the strategy and the pathway actions. And the second being the need to accommodate the implementation of the strategy through the regulatory planning framework in Hawke's Bay. So the intention being that the recommendations in this background report, and which will flow through into the regulatory chapter, are to describe the considerations that are needed so that the strategy can be implemented, but they're not going to provide the exact words, or they're not intended to replace the evaluation of options and considerations that are needed by Section 32 of the Resource Management Act in developing these documents. So the concepts will be there, but not the words exactly. So the consentability and policy and regulatory review reports, so these background papers, the recommendations from these background papers are captured in the background report. The consentability report focused on consenting requirements for the short-term actions of the pathways, while the policy and regulatory review report identified a range of areas where the strategy can continue to influence nationally consistent direction, so through the Building Act, the Coastal Policy Statement, for example. And it also identifies the different approaches to the management of coastal hazards currently between Hastings District Council and Napier City Council and other councils in the region, and recommends that these inconsistencies are resolved. The first of the two regulatory issues that we explore is the risk of perverse outcomes. So the potential that these arise from the implementation of adaptation actions. So this might be what you've previously referred to as moral hazards, which has an origin in sort of insurance and economics. But the concept of maladaptation is now used by the IPCC and in the National Climate Change Risk Assessment to better describe, we think, the unintended consequences that this regulatory chapter is trying to avoid. So we've used that term in the background report. So what does maladaptation look like? Well, some examples of what it could mean are things like new subdivisions behind a new seawall, or removing a coastal hazard zone following the installation of some groins, not ensuring that the pathways are continuing to be adaptive and responding to new information, and perhaps perceptions of safety and decisions on investment for a property that might be, say, outside of a hazard zone but quite close to it. So really the idea being that people make decisions based on a perception of safety from an action being taken to mitigate coastal hazards when perhaps that's not the right long-term action. So why is it important that these things are addressed? Our report looks at these four main topics for why it's important to address maladaptation. So essentially, timing is really important. Trying to preempt these risks from happening before they're in place. So trying to manage maladaptation risks at the same time or before you're looking to implement your coastal hazard implementation action. Education and engagement with the community is obviously really important too, making it clear what the purpose of the actions are there to do, things like their anticipated time frame for efficacy and the likelihood of other actions being needed in the long or medium term. So setting expectations around what those actions are there to do and perhaps what they're not there to do. Regulatory reinforcement, so I guess acknowledging that while many people may choose to mitigate these risks on their own, it's unlikely to be enough. And we think that alongside the education and the engagement, there's a role for the regulatory framework to reinforce the need to avoid these risks where we can. And then finally, just on legislative misalignment. So something that's come up in the discussion nationally around maladaptation is essentially the differences and the challenges in implementing different pieces of legislation that might send a different message. So for example, there are different tests for declining a building consent for a property in a hazard zone versus perhaps how you might manage that under the Resource Management Act. And inconsistencies in this approach can be obviously confusing for the community to understand, but also really challenging for councils to implement and be consistent in their approach. So while this is beyond obviously the regional and district councils, it's something that I think is important to still influence nationally. So that's a recommendation that we're making. So just going to the nature of the recommendations, essentially they are broken down into sort of 3 areas. So national influence, influence at the regional policy statement level, and then activities through regional and district plans. So influencing how maladaptation can be addressed nationally, so whether this is through the National Climate Change Risk Assessment or the future National Policy Statement for Natural Hazard Decision Making. These are the types of areas where the conversations around maladaptation need to continue and need to provide good direction nationally. And also addressing those inconsistency or misalignment issues in legislation, such as through the RMA and the Building Act. A key area of focus really is through the regional policy statement. So this is the overarching management tool for the region, and as such it has a key role in implementing and directing the regional plan and the district plan also. So addressing and identifying maladaptation risks at that policy statement level, requiring consideration of aligning of the timing of implementation actions and actions to avoid maladaptation risks. Considerations of perhaps limits on new subdivision and development in areas where they're subject to coastal hazard risk, and looking at whether there need to be controls on expansion of existing development. Thinking about things like timeframes for structures and whether perhaps movable or temporary timeframes associated with buildings could be a management technique to use, and really directing consistency in the approach used essentially across the region, but as a starting point in the coastal hazards strategy relevant area. Then in terms of regional and district plans, so we would recommend that there are provisions that seek to avoid, where practicable, or mitigate maladaptation risks, looking at things like when these rules might be triggered, the methods for identifying the physical location and extent of where these rules might apply, and the timeframes for their application. So really it's a whole package of activities and provisions that will seek to try and manage these risks. So the second regulatory issue that we've explored is actually implementing the strategy. So obviously the strategy proposes to implement a series of adaptation actions through the pathways for each of the 9 priority units. And to implement these actions, approvals will be required under the relevant regional and district planning documents. And we've realised that there's a balance to strike here between giving certainty to the implementation of the strategy and comparing that with the need to ensure robust decision making against the relevant planning documents, so against resource consent requirements. And we're also looking to prepare not only for the short-term actions, but also looking at what actions may be needed in the longer term as many of these actions will need longer planning times and lead-in times to ensure that they can be implemented. So in order to understand this issue a little bit more, we've looked at some case studies from current examples in the region. So we've looked at the example of the consent held by Hastings District Council to undertake beach scraping and renourishment between Hamoana and Tiawonga. So although they hold a consent, Hastings District Council hold a consent, there are real challenges with actually being able to implement this consent for its intended purpose due to things like funding, actually having the money available to do the work, and access to the renourishment materials that are required as a condition of that resource consent. Another example is associated with the Clifton revetment and the process that was undertaken to achieve consent in that instance. So just looks at the challenges around the consenting process and in terms of having to hold a significant hearing for that process despite a lot of support for that project in the community. And then we also just touch on the Rangatira revetment and the just the discussion around the significant amendment to the proposed design of that revetment as a result of engagement with the community and whether that has an influence on the outcome of the desired plan. We also look at managed retreat and the lead times that are needed to basically do all of the things that are associated with managed retreat, which includes finding alternative locations, securing that land, undertaking building works and development of infrastructure and community spaces. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're thinking to implement the strategy. So the nature of the recommendations, again, are similar to the perverse outcomes in that we've broken them into sort of 3 categories. So the national influence, the role of the regional policy statement, and then regional and district plans. So again, advocating for national direction to support the implementation of coastal hazard strategies such as this one would be really beneficial in terms of giving it weight in other planning processes. Again, the regional policy statement has a key role to play in terms of making provisions specific for the strategy implementation, outlining roles and responsibilities, who's going to do what, avoiding unnecessary duplication in consenting requirements, so making sure we're as streamlined as we can be, and addressing costs and budgets for implementing the adaptation actions. And at the regional and district planning level, we're recommending consideration of activity status and notification requirements specific to activities that achieve the strategy implementation. Finally, just talking about the transition period. So there will be a sort of 3-phase period of transition from where we are now, which is prior to the strategy adoption, where we're relying on the interim response plan to kind of provide that overarching guidance for the region. And then after that, once the strategy's been adopted, but before it can be implemented and reflected in the regulatory planning framework, it's kind of the tricky middle period where we'll still need to rely on that interim response plan, but we'll also need to have a real focus on ensuring that the strategy is implemented as quickly as possible. And then phase 3 is where we want to end up. So that's the stage once the strategy has been adopted and the recommendations from the strategy and the regulatory chapter are reflected through the various planning documents. Once we reach here, things like resource consents for the pathway actions will be able to be obtained where those are needed. The potential for maladaptation will be identified and actively managed. Future planning for managed retreat will be underway, and effectiveness monitoring, specifically in relation to managing and adapting to coastal hazard risks, will be underway. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a lot of words, once again.
Yeah, I know. Sorry about that.
And the report is quite extensive too. You know, you wouldn't want to start reading it at 10 o'clock at night because you won't get through it with your eyes open. Anyway, but thank you very much for your work. That's much appreciated. And I particularly like, if you want to talk to a layman and I call myself a layman in this case, that little stick figure person, or the person sits there with a domino circle around them, that's a really good example to the community while we're actually doing certain things, that while you're actually pushing a little domino to the side, what effect that actually may have, and in the community, and may even us here around this table may not have vision over that and acknowledge that until you actually start working through those regulatory processes, what actually the end result will be. So thank you very much for that. Have I got any, Hayley and then Elwyn?
Thank you very much, Deborah. Through the chair, my question's kind of around the context of this paper and how it fits into where we're going. So in here it says it's recommendations for future amendments to the local regulatory planning framework. But that isn't a person or a group of people, is it? It's a thing. So who's the end customer of this, or is it multiple customers? And how do we make sure that this is getting to the people who need to be reading it in order to do the influencing that the recommendations are putting forward?
I reckon that we're going to have a go.
Well, yeah, I think what it's doing is it's pointing to us as a strategy that we have various areas that we need to influence. We can't instruct or tell the people who write these policies because they've got due process to do that. But it's certainly within our program to promote these concepts into these other policy documents. So I think there's an element of risk, because although we might want them to be represented, we're not actually responsible for all of those documents, but we certainly champion it. And one is around the consenting framework for the program. So in the regional coastal policy, we would want to try and represent that we have a program that's well considered, well researched, and so we'd want to reflect an easier pathway, or certainly not a prohibited status for coastal structures, for example. So that's so that a lot of that work sits with us progressively moving forward.
So we should be reading this as a list of recommended advocacy things that we should be doing as a committee.
I think I'll probably add a bit more to that, and Deb may have a comment as well to add. I think if we remember, this is going to be touchboard and HBRC strategy, right? So when they adopt this, it's going to include all the things that their own framework needs to accommodate. And I think, as Deb highlighted, the RPS has a quite primary role in setting the direction for this stuff going forward. So it'll be a strategy of this council to update its own documents to reflect these outcomes, as well as you say, advocating for the TAs to follow suit, and also up to central government around their own policy frameworks. It's a combination of assigning tasks to itself as a council and advocating for change elsewhere. Deb, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it really well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Howard.
Thank you. My question's around maladaptation and moral hazard, and what sort of provisions would go in a district plan to address that. Examples of provisions that would go into a district plan to address that.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
And in a situation where managed retreat is a identified option in the longer term, what would go in a district plan currently to address that?
Thanks for your question. And I think what's important is that we're not trying to preempt what the district plan might direct. So there might be a range of maladaptation risks that arise from, say, potential development in a coastal hazard zone. So we would need it's almost on a case-by-case basis to look at, okay, if you're going to be approving an application for a subdivision activity in a certain location, what might be the risks that come along with that, and do you need to not approve that consent, or do you need to approve it with a time frame that perhaps isn't as long term as people would suggest for their buildings in that subdivision? So there might be a range of ways that you try and address those risks, looking at the longer term action in the pathway. So yeah, I guess we haven't tried to identify what all those risks are, and that's the responsibilities of coming through the regional policy statement of the regional council and district council to identify those.
See, if I just add one thing that if I can. Sorry,
Go
Chair.
ahead.
Just that we usefully already have a coastal hazards zone in this region, which in the Hastings district is set by the regional coastal plan from HBRC, and for at least part of Napier in your own district plan there. So we already have some layers that not prevent, but have some restrictions, right? I'm looking to the team over there in terms of how much development and investment can happen, basically for this purpose. I think what we want to do as a starting point is, do those go far enough? And are we, by increasing resilience, actually going to open the floodgates for more subdivision, more investment, more development, and therefore make the problem ultimately worse? So as Deb says, we can't interrogate all the policy options on that at this level, but we can certainly direct that further work's required to make sure we get that balance right.
Zane?
Kia ora, Chair, and through you, question for Deb, and thank you, Deb, for condensing a very dense but worthy document into a few slides for us. It's very helpful. Look, my question is directed towards the challenge and the opportunity around our RPS. Now, I came into this thinking, right, well, we're in the middle of an RPS review and we've been granted some extra time to do that for a bunch of reasons. And so, well, hey, we can get this right. But the report says, well, actually, we've probably missed the boat already, and the only avenue is to go through submissions. I'd just like some comment from you on that, where we're at in terms of timing and maybe the relationships involved to achieve that, but also the barriers, what that actually looks like. And just a couple of observations to help you with that. One is that I note some comments, some quite large differences perhaps between territorial authorities, the TLAs, their approach to zoning and coastal, and the recommendation that we need a consistent zoning. And the other thing is the weight that the RPS actually carries, because I note your report says that the TLAs have to have regard to it, which is not as strong as having to actually give effect to it. So hopefully there's a question in there that you can answer.
Thanks. So I guess, yeah, in terms of timing, it's I guess a little bit. So I'm not super up to speed with where both the strategy implementation, like what the time frame of that is and what the time frames associated with the RPS are. But my understanding is that the RPS will be further progressed from a development perspective to the point where the strategy, once it's live, may only be able to have some sort of weight as a approved council document once the RPS has already been through the first sort of notification stage. So that's why I'm suggesting that perhaps the submission period might be the opportunity. But if there is an opportunity to do that earlier and say one or other, the RPS is, if there's delays that mean that the strategy can be approved and implemented beforehand, then that's definitely beneficial. That sort of skips a waiting period or a period where you might look to have to make changes to that RPS to reflect the strategy. So I think where we can, we should do it as soon as possible.
Thank you. Does that answer your question?
Well, if I could just comment. Thank you, Deborah, that's really useful. It just seems to be a little bit of a gap and an opportunity for this committee just to understand what the opportunity is, how much influence, how much we can expect out of the RPS, what that window is. And there might be some of the recommended changes which are not big, that are of a size and of a complexity that we can get in now, and the others that might take some time. For example, unified zoning, I imagine, is a very complicated thing to achieve. Anyway, so I think we could usefully, perhaps for our next meeting, get a report back from staff on the relationship between this report and the activity that's going on in the RPS and what that opportunity is.
Yeah. Okay. Just through the chair, looking at Gavin in the back row. Have you got any comments, Gav, to make on that?
Possibly if I can offer some reassurance that some of us at the officer level have feet in multiple camps around here. So we've, like myself, I'll speak for myself, present in the coastal hazard strategy conversations, also actively involved in day job, helping assist preparation or drafting of the regional policy statement. Another foot, if I had one, standing in the camp of the future development strategy work for Napier Hastings urban growth. So the list goes on. So at a officer, council advisor sort of level, all of these sorts of conversations are swirling around cross-pollinating one another. While at the governance table, yes, we might have a coastal hazards joint committee, we might have a future development strategy joint committee, we have a regional planning committee overseeing the regional policy statement, and so on and so forth. Those sorts of connections and cross-pollinations are still in our pipeline of work to come together, and there'll be another connection required to drop into the Napier district plan and the asset management strategies of the respective councils in due course. So all I'm trying to paint a picture of is that there is indeed some cross-pollination occurring in amongst the councils at staffing levels, and in due course there will need to be the opportunity for cross-pollination and consideration at the respective governance tables, with or without finally adopted coastal strategies on the books. We need to remain alive to how the strategy might land in September, and wherever our RPS drafting may or may not be at that point in time, we just need to be relatively agile, and nothing is set in stone with this work at the current point in time. Is that helpful?
Yep.
It's some reassurance, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question was to Deborah, but I think you're the better one to answer this one. Between phase 1, 2 and 3, there's going to be a time period. Now, phase 2 is adapting the strategy, and then phase 3 was actually when it actually is all written in legislation, and then we actually can start doing this work. That time frame in between is quite important, because if Keith was here, he would say, well, that's going to be a period that we're going to kick the can. So once again, we may be hand-tied in actually getting consent if required. And that's a question, will we be hand-tied to wait for this process to follow right through to implementation? And will that mean that some of the consents just will not be able to get across the line, or could be very expensive, whatever the question may be?
Well, this regulatory paper does talk about trying to lower the bar for consenting of things that the strategy is trying to support or endorse. And if that bar does take time to get in place into our regional plans and district plans and the like, for the time being, that bar will stay relatively high.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, it will be a hard, high, perhaps more expensive leap to get over that higher bar. Depends on how urgent or timely it is to get those consents in our back pocket to do further implementation. And if we can wait 5 years to get the consent, maybe in 5 years' time that planning regulatory bar is lowered. So we should be thinking about, do we need to apply for resource consents from day one that the strategy is adopted? Or is there a sequence of events, including some realignment of these planning documents to lower that consenting bar to make our job of overall implementation much, much easier?
So my question there was 2 questions there.
Sorry.
Time frame, how long may that possibly be?
Chair and many other members around the table will know that, unfortunately, RMA plan change processes do not happen with particular pace or agility. We hope that the government will change that in our favour, but under the current regimes, I would say any plan change and sequence of events to get the RPS realigned, to get the regional plan provisions tweaked, to get the district plans realigned, you're easily talking the best part of, I want to say, 10 years under the current RMA planning system. I just want to, sort of put that out there to manage some expectations that it ain't a 2-year job.
Yeah, and those, it's good to hear that, because otherwise, people may get frustrations if we've got the wrong expectations.
Thanks, Chair. If I can add a couple of things there. I think we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, 1, 2, 4 coastal mitigation projects gain consent. So Clifton, Cape View Corner, the Whakariri revetment. What was the fourth one I had in mind? Anyway, there's been a number of consents that have been granted for that type of activity on the coast. So it's not like there is an impossible barrier right now, but it certainly is challenging. But I think also we should be careful, and the paper that Deb's prepared is pretty deliberate about this. We're not saying that we should be just simply giving a rubber stamp to everything we're suggesting here. There have been legitimate concerns raised by, for example, Mana Whenua around the impacts of gravel nourishment. So we don't want to create some sort of rubber stamping, free pass, lack of rigor process to rush things through. There's a balance to strike between good, robust process, but not fundamentally a barrier, I suppose. So there is a real line to walk there. To me, personally, there's almost a bigger concern about the second issue Deb's raised around this maladaptation risk. Whereas if we do get consents for large-scale risk reduction on the coastline, does that then open the floodgates for more development? That's in that transitional period Deb's mentioned. That to me is almost a greater concern than sort of giving a easier pathway to consents.
Yeah, I don't think we're looking for an easy pathway to rubber stamp. We just need to understand what the regulatory framework will allow us to do and what timeframes. And that's the only way we can work.
So at a high level, we know that our consents are achievable on balance. So that's quite good to know.
Yeah.
But there's significant effort and cost. So, and we'll deal with the rules in place at the time, and then progressively work through.
Okay. Any other further questions on this report?
Just thank you, Deborah. From a planning perspective, it can cure your insomnia, no worries. But it didn't cure mine. But I'd just like to sort of back up Gavin there with this collab with our councils, and which is what I touched on with Keith this morning about this collaboration with the councils. I think it's imperative. The regional council can't do this on their own, nor can HDC or Napier City Council. We've got to do it together. And what else have I put here? And we've actually got to be bold. I mean, because it's easier to sort of tiptoe around and set objectives and rules, but actually to prevent, what will essentially come at us in the future due to climate change. We've got to be a bit bold, and I'm not sure if we're bold enough to make those decisions, because when you make those bold, those very bold decisions, it does upset communities today, but it's actually the future communities that we probably need to focus a little bit more on. So, it's great to have Gavin here. I'm not sure how often Gavin's team are in on these conversations. I hope all the time to hear what's going on, because the layers of the RMA are so complex. And he's right, 10 years, we're looking at a 10-year with plan changes, and that's not going to happen, it's just not a tomorrow's answer. So I'm not sure how, the strategy that we're trying to implement, is that going to have a quicker effect right now, today, so that we can effect some change? Or do we have to wait for a 10-year plan change, as Gavin has said? So it's trying to find this balance, because things are happening today that we need to fix, but we can't wait 10 years for a plan change. So I guess this is this balancing act of, is it the plan change first or the coastal strategy being signed off to get us across the line?
Okay.
So thank you, Gavin, for your insight there.
Thank you. Nigel?
Yeah, just having read the report and looking at table 4, I just wonder whether our recommendation in the report is actually a little bit light. There are some reasonably clear recommendations in table 4 around what the regional council could do, around what the Napier City Council and the Hastings Council could do. And I just wonder whether we should, as a committee, be communicating those recommendations to our planning staffs for feedback to see whether there is opportunity to incorporate these changes, because it's not just about working together, it's about working consistently, and that's where these recommendations sit, around establishing a consistent framework within which everyone is operating. And I just wonder whether we just need to communicate table 4 with our planning staffs to get some feedback about feasibility, because obviously Napier City is going through their district plan process now, but are we too late to make a change? Is the question that needs to be asked, or could that simple change be incorporated without too much drama?
I'm certainly happy to do that. I mean, if it's of benefit, I know that Deborah did consult with each of the 3 councils as part of developing the report. So Gavin, I know Connie fed into it, Mark, I think, and Rowan from Hastings fed into it. So there has been staff input to get to this stage. I'm not sure, Deborah, about communicating the full finished product. Has that step happened from your side?
It hasn't yet, no.
Right, so I think with that, certainly we can...
This is the age-old theory. It's all well and good to have a report sitting on the table, but if we don't flag some of the recommendations out of the report to key participants in the process, they'll never know that those recommendations are sitting there.
Sure. Well, if it's through the chair, we could assign an action to tag from this joint committee, making sure that that report is circulated and socialised, and perhaps further discussions are held to make sure that, as you say, those opportunities that might arise in the short term are followed up on.
Even if it's just feedback on when,
Yep.
if the recommendations are practical for inclusion and change, and what the timeframe would be for such a change to occur, I think would be helpful feedback.
So you'll recall in the terms of reference, there's an advocacy role for this committee, and it can be as simply as the chair writing to each of the organisations, reminding them of these opportunities as an advocacy activity is another suggestion.
It could be, but I would say through tag, at this point in time is possibly the quickest way to do that, because we've got all entities represented there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just on that, it's in the weeds a little bit, but have we put this forward for Napier's district plan? We put any submission or put anything in for consideration at the hearings?
Seeing
The
that you take from
development.
Connie, but
We haven't modified our coastal hazards chapter yet. It's still drafting. It's coming as a variation.
The natural hazards chapter, is that the one?
Yeah. Natural hazards chapter.
Which includes, And so has this information fed into the thinking of the development of that chapter? You know, this.
I'm not all over the development of the natural hazards chapter.
We can.
I'd assume so.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Alvin?
Thank you. So the cost of consenting, will it be more cost effective to go for consent of the whole strategy rather than we've had 3, possibly 4 individual stopgap measures that have needed consenting on the way along? So I'm talking about waiting 10 years till the bar's lowered, etc., and a lower cost, or is it going to be more cost effective to keep going and start to address the problems rather than picking them up individually?
yeah, through the chair, that's a really good question. And Deb and I have had a few chats about that. It's almost like, what is the consenting strategy for this work? How do you bundle them up? Do you go community by community? There are risks and benefits with all of those options. That is a piece of work that I think would need to happen as part of implementation. You know, what is the most effective consenting pathway? That might also feed into what's the most urgent piece of work. sometimes if you have a much bigger consent, the whole thing can get held up in a hearing, and actually you're better off doing one bit to get that across the line. So there's a consenting strategy question there. I couldn't answer it right now. I wonder, Deb, has your report considered that consenting strategy question at the moment in terms of
No, it hasn't at the moment.
Nothing, okay. So there might be merit in considering some advice around the need to develop that. Make sure it's done in the most efficient way.
Okay. I thought that was going to be a really quick meeting, but but I think this is really important material that we need to discuss and we need to understand. And so that's part of the strategy. So any other questions, comments? If not,
Chair, sorry, I have to, sorry.
Yep, please
But just an action point, because I see Connor's here and Evan and 3C policy planning team. I mean, is there an action point to direct our policy and planning teams of these councils to have a little bit of a working group to work together on this?
So
It's just a question, just throw that out.
Yeah.
look, I think that falls into the discussion. So are the planning teams for all the councils are already represented on TAG? This joint committee has within its terms of reference a role of advocacy. So although we can't direct any council of what to do, staff are already collaborating and working together on this, which is how the paper was actually put together. I think the question is, how can we speed it up or make it stronger? And I guess that's effectively what we need to work through. So the option at the moment, I think, was for TAG to make sure that this information was being shared, but there is a stronger actions of advocacy that could be considered. And we're always looking at how we should submit on the various changes to plans to advocate for our position. But it also comes with risk, because just because we want something doesn't mean that it will necessarily be delivered, because there'll be counter views and a whole lot of process that needs to be worked through as well. So I think that covers it. So I don't think we need a direction.
Okay.
I think we already have the planning teams represented.
Cool.
But we're certainly taking it on board. We need to facilitate this work further.
I guess, I didn't want, I guess not direct, but I just wanted to have a level of comfort that going back to this collab, I'm going to keep going on about it, that those teams within the councils are collaborating and working together, and not in a silo or isolation. So that's just that.
Yeah.
Thank you, team. Thank you.
Well, if not, any other questions, comments? If not, then I would like to move that we receive this regulatory workstream background paper by staff. Have we got a seconder? Thank you. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Against? Ayes have it. We're flying again. Communications and engagement update. No doubt it's you again, Simon.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering, interest of time, happy to take the paper as read. Rebecca's here to help with any questions you might have, so perhaps we go straight to questions.
Questions? Comments? Zan?
Yeah, not sure whether this is a question or comment. I'll try and I'll raise a concern.
I will be out of order if it's not a question, okay?
So, speaking from a Hawke's Bay Regional Council perspective, going through a LTP at the moment, knowing that we have to look at an LTP amendment, I'm just recognising that there may well be this may not be the only amendment that we choose to pursue during this calendar year. So there may well be, as a result of our LTP deliberations, there may be some other amendments that we choose to look. And I don't know the answer as to whether we would want to whether there will be any, whether we would want to bundle them up. But I'm just concerned, just to factor that, so that the comms plan just factors in that possibility or the question about whether these would be joint if there are some other elements that the regional council, because this will be a live question that us as councillors will have to sit around and grapple with. So I just wanted to put that on your radar in terms of not getting so far ahead in the comms plan that get derailed in part or in whole because of something that we did as a council because of the other things we're trying to deal with. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much.
And just a follow-up question, if I may.
Yep.
What is the legal time frame after an LTP for an amendment to take place?
Ooh.
We have a visitor who would like to comment.
Through you, Mr. Chair, basically you can do it at any time.
Okay.
So as soon as I've actually seen it done, where a council adopted their LTP in mid-June, and early July they started consulting on another issue that required an LTP amendment because of the significant nature of it.
Thank you. I just wanted that clarified. Thank you.
In regards to our communication with the community prior to us going out for submissions or when we go out for submissions, I think it's very important. This particular community that we're talking about is very strong on actually a face-to-face, and I believe that our councils recently have adopted to actually have drop-in sessions. Personally, I think, and I would like to put on the table now, that my view is that we should actually meet with communities as a whole rather than as individuals. It is harder, it is more difficult, it can be quite hectic and noisy, and people have different views, but to hear the total view of the total community is actually very important. Not saying that there is actually not a mix that we could possibly adopt, like drop-in as well as town hall, let's call them a town hall, but they both have their places, and we shouldn't take the easy option of drop-in. We should actually get town hall, and it's, you know, even with your community as well, Diana, that we maybe need to go and meet and sit down and have a discussion so they fully understand. And maybe even when people are invited to submit, that actually, I always say follow the money, is actually that they know beforehand without having to troll the whole policy statements and whatnot to find out what actually their cost eventually may be. But actually there is actually already an indication for them what they actually as Beach Road 5 are in for. I don't know whether we can, but I think that is very important that people understand, because then all of a sudden you'll have people that actually, hey, this actually will actually hurt me, or actually it's not as bad as I thought it would be. And I'll just give you one example. Yes, there were Puckafi Category 2 meetings, and they thought they were going to, as a community, we're going to pay for the whole, I don't know how many $1 million worth of stop bank, but if you really look through the documents, it actually is only about $22 per address. So all the angst that they had, if they would have known that beforehand, they wouldn't actually have been quite as vocal as they were. So I think we need to be as much upfront as we can to bring our community along, and no surprises and no secrets. Haley.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and second what you just said then, it's really important. Just looking for a bit of confirmation or reassurance that within our comms and engagement plan that we're starting to talk about that maladaption risk that we brought up in our last paper, because I suppose that at the end of the day it's kind of a comms issue by and large around people's expectations about what they can and can't do. Are we going to start that conversation at the start, or is that complicating it?
I mean, through the chair, pre-engagement is in July, and the whole intent of that is to warm the community up to the types of things that we're looking for their feedback on in the formal process in September, right? So to me, that covers the gamut of the interventions themselves, the costs for them, how they might be shared, but also this maladaptation piece. I think what's swirling in my mind a little bit from today's discussions, both from what Keith presented, but also in the Tiawanga context, that pre-engagement may be more important than perhaps, not that we thought, but it might need a bit more ramping up to make sure that actually we're not I guess that the risk I'm just thinking through is if we end up consulting on strategy that actually has drifted away from public support, which is kind of the question that's put to Keith today, then we're not going to get very far with the strategy. So there might be a need to make sure we are really robust through pre-engagement to surface those risks, including this maladaptation matter you've raised just now. So perhaps to Rebecca, any thoughts or additions to that?
I think around the setting of expectations, what the strategy is here to do and what it's not here to do, because we can overcomplicate it with comms. So trying to figure out a way to explain the wider context and bring in those principles without making it too technical.
Yeah. There's some conflict in that we're presenting ideas and desires that aren't actually backed up by statute. So I think we've got to really target what we're trying to achieve out of the current consultation, because I think we can talk about maladaptation, but a developer can simply, if the statute allows it, it can go through. So I think it's a discussion more than an outcome. I think at a discussion level it's fine, but stating it as an outcome, I think gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah, and just to infer on that a little bit simple, and that's possibly a communication thing, is that once you change terms, and we've seen that with managed retreat, once we change terms within the way we actually communicate, the community sees something in that is maybe not there. And so maladaptation, we may actually need to explain what that word means. It's relevant to what we're talking about, but I think it's important that that they understand what that now means, and put that little stick figure up there, and they'll understand, I hope. Once again, it gets communities upset if you change terminology, and it often happens in the regulatory area, and then what is this about? What danger could this possibly mean for me? Or I don't understand, therefore it has to be wrong. So communications, that's good. Any other comments?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on something you said, Giraffe, and Diane and Charles might have a comment, but rather than going to the Te Wanga Hall, the Hamawana Hall, is it possible to have something at the Coastal Marae to talk about this as part of the pre-consultation?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, and at the same time, Hastings and Napier and ratepayers there have an interest in it. And not everybody will have, but they will have an interest if they know that this actually is going to affect them, because there will be a cost associated, whether it's a cup of coffee or whether it's what else you buy these days is a bit bigger on a regular basis, that they need to understand that. So if you then actually meet with them and at least give them the opportunity to listen to the reasons why and voice why they would support it or not support it is actually quite good. So they actually always have been, since I've been a councillor, that we actually need to listen to our ratepayer. It's very important, and generally we are not very good at it. But hey, that's my soapbox. I'll get off it now. Okay. Comments, questions? If not,
Answer to the question. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Can we? Can I have a seconder and a mover and a seconder for us to receive this communication engagement update from staff? Thank you very much. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Ayes have it. Current coastal projects update.
So again, I think we'll take this as read, Chair. We've got various experts in the room who can help answer any questions, and we have navigated the Te Wanga issue in depth earlier on in the meeting. So really just happy for any questions or clarifications.
Questions or not? Can I, if that's the case, can I please have a mover and a seconder? I've got a mover, I've got a seconder. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Cool. Then we go to the next and the final update and follow-ups from previous meetings. Simon,
All complete, Chair.
can I have a mover in the second?
Yeah, why not?
All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Okay, thank you very much for attending this amazing meeting. There was a lot in it, and I think what we did, we raced through what wasn't so important, but we definitely spent time and gave oxygen to what was important for us to understand going forward. So once again, thank you very much. And actually, I thought by myself, prior to actually getting into the papers, I was actually going to bring my record player, and because I felt that joint committee was just a broken record. You know, we're just having the same old reports, and that's all we did. And then we do the fun stuff, which is the funding workshop. But you know, I didn't bring it along because I didn't need it, because it was actually a very good informative meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
And tell those who are not here that they missed out on on a great joint committee meeting. Good. Good. Shall we have a quick break? I think so. I think that might be a good thing. And then reconvene again, 10 minutes, and it gives.
We're going to close with Tangoio.
Are the same group of people is going to carry on right through? Is that all right, that we actually carry on? And then we'll close at the end of the workshop, if that's okay. 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Will that give you enough time to set up? Okay. Good.